Before there was a flag, a president, or a constitution, America wasn't an empty wilderness. It was a world already full of ancient civilizations.
This is the real story of how 13 fractured colonies toppled an empire, built a republic, and launched history's greatest political experiment.
The birth of a nation. How the United States of America came to be. From 10,000 B.C.E. to 1800 C.E. Before there was a flag, a president, or a constitution, there was land, ancient and alive. For tens of thousands of years, hundreds of indigenous nations, the Haudenosaunee, the Cherokee, the Lakota, the Pueblo, called this continent home. When Europeans arrived, they did not find an empty wilderness. They found a world already full of civilizations. This is where the story of America actually begins. The first Americans, 10,000 B.C.E. to 1490s. During the last ice age, massive glaciers locked so much water into ice that sea levels dropped, exposing a land bridge called Beringia between Siberia and Alaska. Bands of hunters followed mammoths across it, into a continent no human had ever seen. Over thousands of years, they spread south, east, and west, multiplying into hundreds of distinct peoples and languages. By the time Columbus sailed in 1492, historians estimate between 50 and 100 million people already lived in the Americas. Cities like Cahokia, near present-day St. Louis, housed tens of thousands. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy had already established a sophisticated democratic government, binding 5 nations under a great law of peace, a model some scholars believe later influenced the U.S. Constitution itself. Europe arrives, 1492 to 1620. On October 12, 1492, a sailor aboard Columbus's ship spotted land and cried out. Columbus had stumbled upon the Caribbean, thinking it was Asia. He was wrong, but his mistake changed the world forever. Spain moved fast, and conquistadors like Cortez and Pizarro toppled the great empires of the Aztec and the Inca. The real weapon wasn't steel or gunpowder. It was smallpox, measles, and typhus, diseases the indigenous peoples had never encountered. In some regions, more than 90% of the population died within a generation. England, slower to act, watched Spain grow enormously rich and finally made its move. Its first serious attempt, the colony at Roanoke Island in 1587, ended in one of history's greatest mysteries. Governor John White sailed back to England for supplies. When he returned 3 years later, all 117 settlers had vanished. The only clue? A single word carved into a wooden post. Croatoan. No one has ever satisfactorily explained what happened to them. 1607. England plants its first permanent settlement at Jamestown, Virginia. Of the original 104 settlers, only 38 survived the first year, killed by swamp fever, starvation, and conflict with the Powhatan Confederacy. Roots in strange soil, 1607 to 1680. Jamestown was saved, not by gold, which was never found, but by tobacco. John Rolfe developed a variety that sold spectacularly in England, and within a decade, the colonists were shipping thousands of pounds across the Atlantic. The colony had found its purpose, but tobacco farming devoured land and labor, and that insatiable hunger for workers would give birth to the darkest institution in American history. Meanwhile, a very different kind of settler was crossing the Atlantic. The Pilgrims, radical Christians who felt the Church of England was past saving, crammed 102 people onto a small ship called the Mayflower in September 1620. Storms pushed them far north of their intended destination. They landed on the rocky shores of Massachusetts in November, exhausted and terrified. Before a single person stepped off the ship, their leaders wrote a document that would echo through centuries. Solemnly and mutually, in the presence of God and one another, covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic. Simple words, but the idea embedded in them, that people could govern themselves by their own agreement, was a seed. Their first winter killed nearly half of them. With help from a Wampanoag man named Squanto, the survivors learned to plant corn and fish the rivers. The following autumn, in what would become the mythology of the first Thanksgiving, the Pilgrims and their Wampanoag neighbors shared a 3-day harvest feast. It was a moment of fragile, genuine cooperation, one that would not last. The Shadow of Slavery, 1619-1770. In August 1619, a full year before the Mayflower, a Dutch warship arrived in Virginia carrying 20 or so Africans seized from a Portuguese slave ship. They were the first enslaved Africans in the English-American colonies. They were not the last. The institution of chattel slavery, the ownership of human beings as property, grew slowly at first, then with terrifying speed. By the eve of the Revolution, roughly 450,000 enslaved people lived in the 13 colonies. In South Carolina, they outnumbered the free. Enslaved people resisted in every way they could: slowdowns, sabotage, escape, and open revolt. The Stoner Rebellion in South Carolina in 1739 terrified the
colonial establishment. But every colony enacted brutal slave codes to crush resistance. This was the central contradiction lodged in the heart of a society that was simultaneously developing the most sophisticated language of liberty and freedom the world had ever heard, and building its prosperity on human bondage. A war that changed everything. 1754 to 1763. The colonies had been bumping against their neighbors for decades. French settlers pushing south from Canada, Spanish settlements spreading north, and powerful indigenous confederacies playing the European powers against each other with extraordinary skill. The decisive collision came with the French and Indian War, ignited in 1754 when a 22-year-old Virginia militia officer named George Washington led a small force into the Pennsylvania wilderness and accidentally triggered a global conflict, the 7 Years' War, fought across 4 continents. Britain won, spectacularly. France surrendered nearly all its North American territory. The empire was triumphant, enormous, and broke. Someone had to pay the war debt, and Britain looked straight at its American colonies. 1763. Britain's war debt has nearly doubled. Parliament begins taxing the colonies, a decision that will, within 12 years, destroy the empire's hold on North America. The Road to Revolution, 1763 to 1775. It started with a tax on stamps. The Stamp Act of 1765 required colonists to pay a levy on newspapers, legal documents, even playing cards. It seems petty, but for colonists who had been governing themselves for over a century, with no elected voice in Parliament, it was an outrage. No taxation without representation. The slogan moved like fire through every colony. Merchants boycotted. Crowds attacked tax collectors. Britain backed down on the stamps, but kept taxing in other ways. Neither side would yield. On the night of December 16, 1773, members of the Sons of Liberty, some thinly disguised as Mohawk warriors, boarded 3 British ships in Boston Harbor and hurled 342 chests of tea into the black water. Britain's response? The Intolerable Acts, closed Boston Harbor, suspended Massachusetts self-government, and allowed soldiers to be quartered in colonists' homes. This was supposed to punish Massachusetts into submission. Instead, it convinced every other colony that their own liberties were threatened.
In April 1775, British troops marched from Boston to seize a colonial weapons cache. Paul Revere rode through the night to warn the countryside. At Lexington Green at dawn, a small band of militiamen stood in the road. Shots rang out. 8 colonists fell. The exchange of fire that followed at Concord's North Bridge reverberated around the world. The revolution had begun, though most colonists still didn't call it that yet. Independence, 1775 to 1776. The idea of full independence, breaking from the greatest empire on earth, was still considered radical by most colonists. What changed everything was a 47-page pamphlet written by a failed English corset maker named Thomas Paine, who had been in America barely 14 months. Common Sense, published in January 1776, sold 100,000 copies in 3 months in a country of 2.5 million people. Monarchy, Paine argued, was simply absurd. Why should the accident of royal birth give one man power over millions? It was electric. By June of 1776, the mood had shifted decisively. A Virginia delegate named Richard Henry Lee rose in Congress and introduced a resolution. These colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. A committee was formed to write a declaration. The task fell to a tall, red-haired Virginia lawyer, just 33 years old, named Thomas Jefferson. He sat in a rented room in Philadelphia and wrote words that would change the world. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Jefferson wrote those words while owning over 600 enslaved people across his lifetime. The contradiction was visible to everyone who cared to look. But the words themselves were bigger than the man who wrote them, big enough that generations of Americans would invoke them to demand the freedom Jefferson denied them. The Long War, 1776 to 1783. The British Empire was not impressed by declarations. That summer, the largest force Britain had ever sent across the Atlantic, 32,000 troops, arrived in New York. Washington's army was routed again and again. New York fell. The Continental Army melted away through desertion and despair. By December 1776, only a few thousand shivering men remained. The revolution looked finished. Then, on Christmas night, Washington did something breathtaking. In a howling storm of sleet and snow, he led 2,400 men across the ice-choked Delaware River and attacked a Hessian garrison at Trenton, New Jersey, at dawn. The surprise was complete. The victory, small on the map, was immense in what it meant. The army had survived. The flame still burned. The turning point came in October 1777 at Saratoga, New York, where an entire British army was forced to surrender. The victory convinced France, which had been watching carefully from the sidelines, that the Americans could actually win. France formally allied with the United States, and suddenly Britain was fighting a world war. By 1781, with French naval power cutting off British resupply, Washington and the French general Rochambeau trapped Lord Cornwallis on the Yorktown Peninsula in Virginia. After a 3-week siege, Cornwallis surrendered 8,000 men. His army marched out to the tune of "The World Turned Upside Down." It was. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783, gave the United States full independence and territory stretching to the Mississippi River. A new nation existed. Now, it had to figure out how to govern itself. Building the Republic,
1783 to 1789. The first attempt, the Articles of Confederation, was an honorable disaster. So terrified of centralized power, the founders had built a government too weak to function. Congress could beg states for money, but not compel it. There was no president, no federal courts, no power to regulate trade. States fought like rival countries. In 1786, a group of Massachusetts farmers crushed by debt took up arms in what became known as Shays' Rebellion. The national government was helpless to stop it. The crisis convinced the founders. They needed to start over. In the summer of 1787, 55 delegates met in secret in Philadelphia, windows nailed shut against the heat, and spent 4 sweating months arguing, bargaining, and compromising. The result was the United States Constitution, a government of 3 branches, each with power to check and limit the others. It was a system built on the assumption that power will always seek to expand, and that the only cure is to divide it so thoroughly that no one part can dominate.
The slavery compromises written into that document were its original sin. Enslaved people counted as 3/5 of a person for apportionment. The slave trade could not be banned for 20 more years. Escaped enslaved people had to be returned. The Constitution, born in the same summer as those words about liberty, carried slavery's stain from its very first page. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union. The experiment begins. 1789 to 1800. On April 30th, 1789, George Washington stood on the balcony of Federal Hall in New York City and took the oath of office as the first president of the United States. A senator in the crowd wept openly. The experiment in self-government, the idea that people could rule themselves, had officially launched. Washington was acutely aware that everything he did would set a precedent. He moved carefully, deliberately, knowing that future presidents would be watching. When he voluntarily stepped down after 2 terms, it was the most powerful act of his presidency. Proof that leaders give up power when their time is done. In 1791, the Bill of Rights was ratified. 10 amendments carving out permanent freedoms no government could touch. Speech, press, religion, the right to bear arms, protection from unreasonable searches, the right to a fair trial. They remain among the most consequential legal texts in human history. 1800. The Revolution of 1800. Thomas Jefferson defeats the incumbent John Adams in the first genuinely contested presidential election. Power transfers peacefully between opposing political parties. It had never happened before in the history of modern democracy. It was called the Revolution of 1800, and it was. The unfinished experiment. The birth of the United States is not a simple story of heroes and triumph. It is a story of extraordinary courage and catastrophic moral failure, living side by side. The same men writing the most beautiful words about freedom while enslaving other human beings. Those contradictions are not footnotes. They are the very substance of it. And yet, the ideals did matter. The Declaration's promise that all men are created equal became a weapon, used by Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, Susan B. Anthony, and Martin Luther King Jr. to demand that America live up to its own words. The Constitution's framework survived Civil War, Industrial Revolution, economic catastrophe, and world wars. Benjamin Franklin, walking out of the Constitutional Convention in 1787, was stopped by a woman who asked, "Well, doctor, what have we got? A republic or a monarchy?" Franklin looked at her and said, "A republic, if you can keep it." That question was not answered in 1787. It has been answered or failed in every generation since. The birth of the United States was not a moment. it was a beginning. And the experiment, as every American generation discovers anew, is never truly finished. The Birth of a Nation, 15-minute edition, 10,000 BCE to 1800 CE.
A republic born in blood, built on brilliant ideals and scarred by deep contradictions. A history that we are still writing today.